From the very first days of fighting, the world said Israel cannot win. Hamas cannot be destroyed. They cannot be destroyed physically. Their ideology cannot be destroyed. And Israel's two goals, to bring home the hostages and destroy Hamas, were completely unrealistic. Throughout all of the static, there was one voice, that of Colonel John Spencer, who joins us today, who's the head of the Urban Warfare Institute, who has an awesome podcast called the Urban Warfare Project podcast. He has been the single voice that has rung out loud and clear that yes, Israel, you can pursue your goals and continue moving forward. John, I'm so glad to have you with us today. Thank you for joining the True East podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again.
You too. So I understand you just got back from a trip to Israel where you were on the ground, and I think from our discussions, you didn't have an insight that anyone else didn't have that the war was going to end, did you?
No, and I was in Gaza City with the 98th Division, deep in Gaza City, where there was heavy fighting going on, and I had no clue that that would be the last, possibly the last major day of fighting of this period in the war.
So you were there actually at the very, very end as we were withdrawing to the yellow line?
Hours before that direction had come to the IDF. Yes.
Well, John, I'm going to ask you first. Start out with a big question, which is one that I've been asked, and I've been, relying on you all these months. My question is this, and this is where I want to start. Do you feel that the IDF has achieved its military objectives, and do you think that the war is over?
So it's a great question. As somebody who taught war at West Point, taught strategy, what does winning look like is always hard. You have to evaluate it based on the objectives of both sides. Like you just talked about, Israel's objectives after October 7th haven't changed in over 2 years. I do believe, and some people will try to say, this is just you can't start on October 7th. And as a war analyst, no, that's the start date was the Hamas invasion of southern Israel. Now, the end date is going to be tricky. Since there is more than one goal, although all the living hostages are home, and as we're talking, there's still hostages, dead bodies that haven't been given back. But that ultimate goal, destroying Hamas, so this one's tricky as in when was the last day of major fighting? And then when have you achieved your goals? The 20-point plan that President Trump is a very conclusive plan if executed, seals the peace. So as I do case studies, it's a real big part of my research is doing case studies. I will definitely start on October 7th, and I don't know if I'll end at this point yet, as we are in the midst of some very strong uncertainties where we thought Hamas had agreed to disarm a new governance in the Strip, and that may not be true, but the 20-point plan is definitely a turning point. So in war studies, you have these turning points. And of course, for Israel, the return of the hostages is a major turning point, but their goal to destroy Hamas may require entering a different phase. And just like we've seen in the, even recent history, like the Iraq War, when it transitioned from, Operation Iraqi Freedom to Operation New Dawn, the goals changed and there were different actors and things like that. I think that's where we're at this turning point. I won't be the guy that says the war's over, because I know there's a lot of work to be done in order to achieve that goal of destroying Hamas, which is in military parlance means that they can't reconstitute themselves. And they're doing a lot of stuff as we're talking, as they may be signaling they're trying to reconstitute themselves. So that I think will transition to a new phase with a lot of different more requirements, but also different players involved in the war. For over 2 years, this has been Israel against Hamas. And then, of course, a lot of people against Israel's ability even to continue the war. Now, with this very transition, you have other governments directly involved and signing support for helping Israel achieve the goals. And that's a turning point.
So, you actually led into something that I think is on everyone's mind. It's almost we were hesitant to ask the question. Here we are, we're talking, and the 20 hostages, thank God, are home. I mean, it's a miracle. President Trump really did do the impossible, I think. And I think the question everyone's asking is why? I mean, I think we can ask it now that the living hostages are home. Of course, the bodies of the fallen, and that's incredibly painful, are being lit out in drips and drabs. And one of the four bodies today was ID'd having the DNA is not one of the Israeli missing, which could just be another act of Hamas cruelty, or maybe they simply made a mistake because of the state of the bodies. But why, John, do you think Hamas would have given up that card?
So it's a factor of things, and war is political by very nature. War is human. War is uncertain. In this point, based on all that we know in public domain, I only do unclassified research. Is that the factor of holding the living hostages? Once, war is a contest of wills. This is why, going back to your first statements, of course, I thought Israel could be successful, but Hamas had a lot of things inspiring it to continue to believe that it could win. And in the last few months, thanks to President Trump, but also thanks to even the the IDF, the Israel Society, is all the hopes that Hamas thought that it could use the hostages to achieve its goals was removed. Ironclad support from the United States, um, Israel's government agreeing to this very conditions-based conclusive peace plan, but then to have all these Arab and Muslim countries, so that just removes what Hamas was using for 2 years was a divide between the international community and Israel's right to defend itself and continue to try to get its hostages home. But I don't also disconnect, I mean, that's the political, for sure, removing that will, but you have the Israeli strike in Qatar against, although it didn't succeed, but maybe it did succeed on the cognitive domain to say that Israel will do what it takes, even what other people think it wouldn't do,
Mhm.
even politically and geopolitically, to achieve its goals, its right, just goals in the war. And then lastly, the IDF. So Operation Gideon's Chariot B, I think, removed Hamas's ideas that the IDF just wouldn't press into certain areas out of fear of the hostages. And it was really hard to do that. But the factor of all these things combined in space, and of course, the United States being what we are with no hubris, to have that support, unquestionable support, not just with President Trump, but Secretary Rubio, everybody, was a huge part of convincing Hamas that that strategy of using the hostages, which has worked in all the past wars. I even wrote the case study of the first Gaza war, 2008. It's a strategy that has worked for it, but all of that build up together, all three of those factors, to the point where they believed, and I don't think they agreed to a unilateral surrender, but they agreed that thanks to even Qatar, Egypt, all of their allies, openly or behind closed doors, convinced them that they needed to do that, while they probably think that they have strategies, rely on the weariness of nations to try to hold on to power and do something else. But from the hostages breakthrough, I don't think it was one factor. All those factors fell into place. Both the U.S. administration, all the Muslim and Arab countries, the IDF operations, and the Israeli willingness to do what it took removed that hope, because war is a contest of will. And that convinced what is Hamas that's left. And we use this unilateral designation for Hamas. It is, it's a political party. It's a military guerrilla faction. It's an ideology. All these things. So what is Hamas today? Although some of the billionaires in Qatar are the same, is not the same as it was on October 7th. So you're dealing with different, even influence people that you need to influence, both in Qatar and inside Gaza.
Well, let me ask you a question here. We're riding on an agreement that was created by President Trump in Trump fashion, gathering enormous amount of people, completely disruption based, just like he talks about in The Art of the Deal, gets people around the table, passes the deal, gets all these countries together to sign off, and it puts people in the same room that, are fighting, whether it's, on the Muslim side of the equation, or potentially even if when on the Israeli side of the equation with the Abraham Accords. having made peace and potentially future peace between players such as Indonesia and Saudi and many other that are putting forth. One of the things that I'm hearing, and I know I'm curious what you heard when you were here, is someone said to me today, they said, listen, President Trump did the impossible, he got the hostages back. However, he thinks you can solve the problems in the Middle East with money. And he's missing the idea that Hamas is a irrational actor and is cannot be bought, and therefore his financial plans for the Gaza Strip and so on and so forth will not change Hamas ideology. And I know you've been an real advocate of the idea that we have to first, if I may say, remove Hamas's military power, and then you can change their ideology. But is it realistic with a plan like this to change the Hamas ideology and eradicate it from Gaza? And is that necessary?
So the ending is very easy to answer. It's absolutely necessary for any peace for of course Israel, but even for the Palestinian people. Hamas and the radicalization, the continued radicalization of the population has to stop, or this is just a pause in the cycle of violence. And I know there's a lot of people, while the past is prologue, they're like, oh, you just don't understand the Middle East. This was tried in the past, southern Lebanon, other areas, Gaza. It's just the same story in a different time. I don't see it that way. I also don't see the same viewpoint of the Trump doctrine, if we can call it that. That of course he's a businessman. He loves money. That's a big part of the what we call the four forms of national power, and he uses it very heavily. Of course, you have diplomatic, you have information, military, and economic, and he loves the economic national power, and it should. Um, but he also truly embodies, and I try to stay out of politics as, a military
Of
analyst,
course.
but we've been sold a lie about war for a very long time, that you can negotiate with irrational actors. Everybody just wants their interest applied to in war. Again, I think we've been sold a lie. And President Trump and his advisors definitely understand the strength, the peace through strength, and that does come with economic, but also military. As we've seen in the 12 Day of War, as you've seen in even what's going on right now with the drug cartels, President Trump will use military force and not hesitate to, of course, calculated, assesses all the risks, tries all the diplomatic means possible. And this is what I hear when he says he talked to Hamas. And I know he called in during the negotiations multiple times. He said, they told me this. And if they don't like the disarming, President Trump said, they told me they would disarm. Now, if I talk to, and then when I was in Israel, people don't believe that that's possible. Like, oh, they'll never do that. They want the Hezbollah model, which is the technocrat model, right? This is the let some other government come in. They keep their weapons, which is a very, Hezbollah model, even though Hezbollah is involved in the politics, but in Lebanon, that they had their army within a state that technically wasn't the army of the state, but that's a long conversation. I think that that's why I've been so hopeful to this plan, is that it addresses every factor of ending a war. It addresses the fact that I don't care what the interests of Hamas are. I care what the interests of the Palestinian people are. I care what the interests of the leaders in the region are. And that's why this idea, like, well, you have to negotiate with Hamas. You have to no, you don't. They started a war. They lost a war. They don't get any interest in the fallout. Now you have a bunch of countries saying, we will be a part of the solutions. So the fact that the 20-point plan, I think it's point maybe 13 or 17, says if Hamas delays, if Hamas breaks from the plan, this continues, which is so thought through on even the ability to take a small sector, which is very historical in war, start rebuilding it. It's Hamas terror free. And then you do that systematically, called the ink blot strategy, across the Gaza Strip. You start the re-education, like all of these factors. That's why I think that, people that think that this is only an economic deal between all these, different leaders. That's not what I'm seeing. It's a very thought through, even thinking through the irreconcilable aspects of Hamas and what we're seeing right now. Even, President Trump, who sees it, is responding to it like, it's awful. I'm going to give him a short amount of time, and then we're going to continue implementing the plan. to include, in my personal opinion, maybe the necessary aspect of the IDF returning to operations in the Gaza Strip, while some international stabilization force made up of many countries is operating in a different sector. Because as General McMaster said when I interviewed him, which is one of the historians that I greatly respect, as long as Hamas has the guns, there's not going to be stability. You have to take the guns from them. So yes, the hostage was the highest priority, and getting the deceased highest. Next priority is getting the guns, because even what we were seeing, which I didn't talk about, which is another reason that Hamas was losing power in the Gaza Strip. It was losing hope and losing power. So we saw not one clan in southern Gaza. We saw multiple clans, like the clans in Khan Yunis, rising up against Hamas. Hamas was, as an organization, which is, new youth, radicalized, I'm now Hamas, was losing the ability to control anything. They lost control of the humanitarian aid. Now they were losing controls of certain hotbeds in the Gaza Strip. Of course, when the IDF pulled back, now you have this power vacuum, but it's all in this plan. So um, I'm not saying the plan will work. There's lots of hurdles. There's a prioritization, and I would think through some of the criticisms are being mentioned about Trump not understanding the Middle East, Trump doing his thing. You can clearly see in the 20 points that there are a lot of people involved in this, developing the plan and getting everybody involved. Even the fact that it was a 21-point plan that went to a 20-point plan, when the Qatar interest of please don't strike us again, where Hamas is, was taken, that interest was taken off, and you see team building. So while the art of the deal may be what you just talked about, but the Trump doctrine is this multifaceted forms of national power to achieve a goal immediately through signals of strength, not just in resolve, which is very key, but also in clarity in even non-negotiables, right? So, no, you're not going to keep your weapons. I don't care. All these things that are a part of the deal, I think.
To that point, I saw that Prime Minister Netanyahu basically echoed Trump earlier today, and he said there'll be all hell to pay, right? I mean, it was clear that he was taking a Trump line, saying that, okay, apparently there is an idea in this plan of, I don't think it says credible military force or the words military force, but it says a lot of things. I mean, it says those Hamas members who are going to ask for amnesty and hand in their guns will be given amnesty, right? And those who decide to go into exile will go into exile. It's, I think, purposely, it's almost like the elephant in the room doesn't say, okay, the Hamas members who don't seek amnesty and don't go into exile, basically, I think it leaves it open, like you're saying. If they have to be disarmed with force, then apparently that's somehow still on the table.
Absolutely. That's why point number one, as soon as I read that, I'm like, Exactly. Point number one is that the Gaza Strip will be de-radicalized and terror-free." So, and then it says later points that Hamas will have no role. Doesn't say that they'll
Right.
have any. Hamas, that 20-point plan ends Hamas. And yes, it's really hard going back to, that I've been fighting from day one, that, it's really hard to defeat an ideology. It's not impossible. It is very hard, yes, especially in an area that's been radicalized, the youth from birth, Palestinians, Sesame Street, it's awful. All of that has to stop. It's absolutely possible to, step one, take the guns and the power away from the old ideology and start building something new piece by piece. People also discredit the plan because, again, using the past as a prologue in the Middle East, and how big of a task this would be to de-radicalize, and to begin. But there's other places where it has been done and been successful. So I agree that the plan is very, like, every word is very crafted and not so specific to how things will be done. Because I think personally, as again, even within the 2-year war, the way that the Hamas military has been destroyed hasn't been one way. It has been through many ways. And the way that the day after, finally we can start talking about a day after, and I think that's where we're at, didn't mean that all the guns would fall silent, because you have an irreconcilable force. But there is lots of history showing that even when you have that, if you have all this consensus and the support, and that's another transition of this war, is that if this restarts and the IDF are now required to go into certain areas again to do that disarmament part and the stabilization part, they have support that they haven't had for 2 years. Not just the United States, but all these other people who signed up saying that we agree with this plan that includes, again, the restarting of the operations if Hamas gets a vote. If they don't do all the things that are part of the plan and try to wiggle their way out of it, in one sector of the Gaza Strip, you'll restart. In another sector, you can start, which has been delayed because it was all on Israel. Like, let's get some stability in certain areas in Gaza Strip, and it is 100% possible. There are, I mean, one of the clans wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, Southern Gaza is Hamas free. I control medical aid, everything. I'm not saying he's a good guy,
Mhm.
but you could actually create what we call the Disneyland theory. And I've heard people starting to talk about it. Even Amit Segal was talking about this morning on TV. It's called the Disneyland theory. It's like you take a very small portion, you start to build it up in stability. There's no terror organizations, and they get all the services and stuff starts to rebuild. And then not just the insurgents at this, now we can maybe getting close to call Hamas an insurgent force, but not quite. But they see, and all the population see that there is hope to rebuilding, and it's called the Disneyland theory and a little bit of history.
Fascinating. Oh, I wanted to, one of the things, by the way, to what you were saying is we saw the Klan stand up, and then the IDF killed, I think, 20 Hamas members, Hamas terrorists a week or two ago while they were fighting with the clans. And then as soon as this deal was on the table, that same clan, as we know, issued a request to Hamas to kind of make a sulha, which is some type of an agreement, a mediation with Hamas. And Hamas's answer, was, well, we're not going to rush to make a sulha with you. I mean, and so we can see like the slightest little fissure in this plan. These people are scared. And I don't know, the executions we saw in central Gaza today, and I know you posted it, I mean, if we're not incredibly clear that this is going to be, ultimately speaking, unconditional surrender, if I was a clan member in Gaza, a Palestinian clan, a Bedouin clan, I don't know how quick I would be to fight against Hamas. I mean, you have to have some real courage.
Absolutely. And support. And that's, again, I wrote that in a Wall Street op-ed when the first news of arming some of the clans started. Like, that's a tried and true military way. If you have a goal of destroying a power, defeating a power, you arm even the, other organizations that might not like you in general. I'm not saying these clans are pro-Israel and pro-living in coexistence, anything, but this is why so many other elements of the plan are so important, because you can address, again, the creating stability bite by bite, blot by blot in the Gaza Strip with terror-free zones, even that are, again, the stabilization force. What will it do beyond just security is these aspects. And you start talking about Palestinian organizations or people that are terror-free. The plan addresses not just that security element, which is, there's a famous saying that, if security is just 1% of your problem, it's 90% of your problem. You have to address the security in every aspect, which will be hard. And in the Gaza Strip, like you said, as we've seen these groups now, it's about power. And especially in urban settings, the power can be very specific and not necessarily, just tribal or clan based or organization based. They can be very neighborhood specific, and there are different powers, and they will make agreements with other powers like you were talking about. But that's why the plan going forward in this stabilization force for me was that's it, because it allows for stability to start happening in some zones while you take every other bit of it piece by piece, and you're not nation building, Doron. And that will be the other kind of social media generals aspect of this, is that they think it's a failed nation building project. That's not what anybody's talking about. Although there is some communication in this about reforming Palestinian Authority and Palestinian groups and things like that. This isn't about nation building. This is about creating stability and starting the de-radicalization, demilitarization of what we call DDR. And you even mentioned the reconciliation process, where there may be individuals who were a part of Hamas, not a part of the October 7th attack, clearly, that say, I see that this group has no future. And we also saw Hamas trying to rename itself immediately, like Palestinian Security Operation or whatever, the police. That's all, again, historical and normal. And reconciliation is actually a part of post conflict operations as well for some of them. But that's why this plan for me is important. It will face a lot of challenges, to include those who said that they're a part of it, who may, I don't say cold feet, but you have a lot of actors here that have multiple interests like Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, all these. But the plan with the US support is pretty straightforward, and Israel will have support that it hasn't had for 2 years.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that is part of at least in Israel, as we talk to people on the street, that is the one thing, the fact that the president came here and spoke the way he spoke for 70 minutes or however long in the Knesset and rallied, that will go down in history. I think that speech as literally almost on the level of like a biblical historical event, the way that he spoke from that platform, which I think does give Israelis the feeling that we're not alone, as in particular about the United States, which is its own podcast. Why the United States as opposed to so many other countries. I want you to take us back into history for a second, John, because I know that you've done case studies, history, military history better than most people. When Imperial Japan surrendered, and when the Nazi regime surrendered, give us an insight. I mean, if they went through educational reform and became different regimes, and I myself quote this in the news all the time, but to what degree was it essential that, let's say, General MacArthur made Japan surrender on that ship and kind of crushed them completely, and then they were able to build? And I asked it in the context of something specific. I know it's a long question, but the fact that in the re-education, so to speak, and in this whole kind of this bilateral commission, Israel's role is not clear. It's not. It doesn't seem like Israelis are going to go in and do this. It seems like, not my favorite states, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, and the U.S. of course are going to be the ones responsible for perhaps re-educating people, and they themselves are terror states. So, if you could give us like a bit of a historical platform to what degree that's important and how it might play out in Gaza.
Yeah, it's definitely important and interesting. So, Germany versus Japan, the post-conflict operations almost night and day. Japan's a really good case study, because one, the scale is a little different, but the radicalization, right? So in Japan, Imperial Japan, the emperor was a deity. They thought he was God. They would actually sacrifice themselves completely if they believed that he thought they should continue fighting. And while the dropping of the two nuclear bombs were a big part of convincing the enemy that they had no path to victory and that the Allies would do what would be necessary, which was even a ground invasion, which would have cost millions and millions of more alive. It was the emperor's decision, as much so as the Allies' decision to conduct this giant operation. It was the emperor's decision for his will to change. And he actually went on the radio the next morning telling the Japanese people that they had been
Yeah.
defeated. So, it's a contest of will. So war is an act of force to convince your enemy to do your will. In this case, Hamas was to give back the hostages, disarm all that. In the end of World War II for Imperial Japan, it was convince them to unilaterally surrender, not just in the hearts of the fighters who would have fought to the death for the emperor, but for the emperor himself. And that was an important part about the decision to keep him as a part of the governance, was that his role in convincing the people that they had been defeated. If you go back to World War I, which was the big issue with Germany, is that they just thought they were slighted, and that set the seeds for the next World War, and, to that shame. Now, you're right. So that's the difference there with about convincing your enemy to do your will. The emperor said, and talked to the people like, we have been defeated. But then to give them some, so if you really translate that to Palestinian-led reforms, even in the Gaza Strip, and you have Muslim and Arab countries will take major ownership of that, that will be important just culturally to the Palestinian people in Gaza. But then the other element that you talked about, de-radicalization, again, Japan, a great case study because they wanted to do it immediately. So in every school across Japan, the school teachers had to lead the students through opening the books and taking a black marker and writing and covering up anything anti-Western and anti or pro-imperial interest, basically.
Wow.
That was a huge moment. Yeah, I don't know
Wow,
if you know
John,
that,
that
but it's a
is
huge part of
that
history.
is unreal. I did not know that. Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was before they got the new curriculum, right? Because if you want to radicalize a population, it's pretty much known you have to start in the schools. And every really dictator, tyranny, radicalized population, you look at their books and their stories that they're telling, things like that. And if you look at the Palestinian what UNRWA schools, only about 50%, but the other it was awful. But yeah, absolutely. In Japan, it's a great case study. Before they could get new textbooks, and it's really a sign of being defeated that the children's teachers had to lead them through this process of marking out all the things that were radicalizing them in their books and reiterating the message, which takes time, that we're not doing what we used to be doing. We lost the war. We're going to continue forward. We're still going to have a path forward. That was all part of and all the great work that MacArthur and the commissions led, but that educational reform, a huge part of it, but it goes down to, like paraphernalia and all these things. That'll be a part of this. And again, it's some people think it's too hard because it's so massive to do. Although, Gaza specifically, although we shouldn't leave the reforms of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank off this as well, because that's a part of the 20-point plan is looking at whether it's the pay to slave program, the terrorized education in the books, what they say. But for Gaza specifically, while it's a 2 million population, I mean, I fought in a neighborhood of Baghdad that was 2 million. It's a city of 6 million. And if you look at Imperial Japan, it's not the scale of it, it's the principles of it, right? So the fact that the plan says we will do this. Now, the peace board you were talking about, which is, it hasn't been designated like who all's on it. President Trump says, I'm on it. Look, I believe him. But there'll be the actual, what we call board cells and working groups that are doing it. And then who is in charge of the educational reform? Again, whether it's UAE, Saudi Arabia, Muslim, Arab countries that have actually shown ability to create actual education that doesn't radicalize will be a key part of this that I think people are kind of, they're right to be hesitant and cautious about it. But there is examples of de-radicalized entire populations, and it's not a scale problem, it's a commitment problem. And I see in the plan and from all the actors, even if you look at the summit in Egypt, like you got to put your money where your mouth is, and you got to take action, not just words. I'm seeing the signs for a path to peace. Lots of things can go off of it. And this isn't the old, though. This isn't what was tried in the past. This is pretty conclusive.
Interesting. So this is really almost like a new experiment to some degree. I understand it's based on certain things that have happened, but it looks like putting all these things together, this is to some degree a new experiment. What's happening in Gaza, just putting all these factors in one.
In some ways, there are some elements of successful, I don't like the word peacekeepers, but even stabilization forces. And my friend Jacob Stoll just wrote a piece in the Times of Israel looking at successful stabilization forces and how they have to address security and things like that. And there are some cultural, like you said, new facets of this, although Japan's a great example where, American leadership, ownership, but you still had a Japanese leadership of the reform, and that was necessary rather than other models where you just come in and you lost a war and you have to force it on them. There are some nuances here, but there's lots of lessons learned that will actually help in the process, even showing Israelis. And that's why I think this podcast that you do and others is important to talk about. This isn't just Gaza War 3.0. There's a lot of newness here. That it isn't, first Lebanon War, second Lebanon War. There's a lot of words here, and you got to follow that with action. But I think there's the commitment to do something different in this location while taking the best practices of other locations.
John, something that now kind of dawned on me while speaking with you is that first point. And I think that you really nailed it. And it was kind of the light turned on for me. If you look at the 20 point, the first point is really what ties all this together. So I guess what I'm thinking, almost rebranding that the 20-point plan is conditional on the first point. It's not like 20 individual points. And therefore, um, again, I'm not trying to be political, but I do want to say this, that the father of this project is Donald Trump. Therefore, we better roll out this plan quickly while he is president of the United States, because if you don't have that person, that's what was missing in the pullout of Lebanon in 2006. I also fought in the Second Lebanon War, and we had 1701 and created UNIFIL. There was no one with a big stick to make sure UNIFIL did what they did. And they didn't do what they did. And then Hezbollah, from what I understand what you're saying, this better be tried and put into work while President Trump is in the White House, basically.
Absolutely. And I think that's, again, one of I 100% agree with you. And you don't want, which is a thing in the Middle East and in any insurgency, if we get to that phase, is that they always say that while you have the watches, I have the time. And they'll just wait this out, right? They wait a
Mhm.
presidency out. They wait like all these things out. And that could be in their minds of, we just got to survive this period. So you're right. But in a disadvantage to the bad side of this is that Trump isn't patient. He isn't about uh, even what he's been making comments about, hostage return, disarming, all that stuff. You're absolutely right that many factors of this have to be implemented quickly, not just to get things done in that, the 3 years of President Trump and Israel politics, of course, is a factor as well, but just as a signal again to the enemy. It's about will. So convincing them that you're not going to wait this out. Your strategy of re-seizing power, renaming yourself, saying you won't give up defensive arms, like, it ain't going to work. And you have to implement it rapidly. And I'm seeing those signs as we're talking, even uh, if you don't do it, even either disarm the easy way or the hard way. It's all been discussed. There's a plan for it. And it isn't for later. And I think by something you said was really important to me as well, as I push back against the naysayers, even if you go back to Oslo, right? In Natan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy, really walks through a couple of those key moments. Is that even Natan Sharansky was like just pushing, like, have it conditions based. Don't just have aspirational or gifts. Everything in a 20-point plan, as you mentioned, is conditions based. Even for the Palestinian Authority, like, yeah, you can be a part of this after you
Mhm.
reform, and we validate that you have reformed. So that was another part of this plan, unlike all the others, and you got to give President Trump and his administration credit. It's conditions based almost every point. It isn't just, yeah, we'll give you this, we're making a deal, phase plan. Like, no, no, no. This is conditions based, and it is they, although he won't state the times, and I have seen already reporters pushing like, "Oh, how long are you going to give them to give up the bodies or to disarm?" And if anything, his history recently, the last 8, 9 months, is that it isn't a lot of
Yeah.
time. He won't tell you how much, but it isn't a
Yeah,
lot.
his watch goes according to days, not months.
That's right.
John, I want to take you underground for a second, where you thrive, and I will just again say that listening to your urban warfare podcast, one of the insights for me of what you called the weasels, which is Israel's underground, known as Yahalom, and an element of Yahalom, which takes care of tunnel warfare. Part of this second phase that Trump said yesterday, the bodies aren't home, the second phase has to begin now, is the demilitarization or destruction of Hamas infrastructure. And I know you weighed in on this. And I think for myself and for the viewers and the listeners, we're looking to defeat Hamas ultimately, demilitarize them. Why is there such an emphasis on destroying the tunnels? I mean, there are so many, and I've been in them, you've been in them, hundreds of miles of tunnels. It seems like a colossal task. To what degree of going tunnel by tunnel by tunnel can't Hamas just be making more and more and more tunnels? Why is that so essential to defeating the enemy?
It's so this is a big, we need a whole podcast to cover it. Even the history of tunnel warfare and tunnels that are left behind being used by new powers later. Um, these tunnels specifically, though, what is built in Gaza has never been seen in history, really. Although massive tunnels have been seen in many wars, and I know I've actually been with in the ancient city of David and the water tunnel and how it was used in ancient Jerusalem, and honored to have that podcast episode because it is ancient. But these tunnels to coincide with Hamas or whatever would come later of using the surface as a shield and a sacrifice for the strategy to wait out and international condemnation and the TikTok wars. It's really important for any post-conflict operation is to remove military infrastructure. And these aren't dual purpose in any way. These are solely for military purposes. And it has evolved even since 2005, really, tunnels, tunnel bombs, cross-border tunnels, and what we've seen now with this cities underneath every step of ground in Gaza. And that was a big part of my study last week. Like, what do we know? What does the IDF know about the true extent of it? And I think even some of the planners of at a larger scale really don't understand. But I think they understand that it's a part of the demilitarization as heavily as disarming is, because these tunnels would provide still military capabilities. That's why it's called infrastructure of hiding, planning, storing smuggled goods, all this stuff. So, it's a monumentous task to take on, but I see it in the plan, although I don't think it states tunnels. It just talks about infrastructure,
Right.
which is really the main infrastructure that still is very prevalent. I mean, you're talking, there was one estimate of 500 kilometers, and I actually think that it's maybe close to double
Hmm.
that after my recent visit and the layering of tunnels. Uh, and there's a priority of tunnels. So the IDF, based on the objectives at the time, whether it's the Gaza division and creating the buffer zone or the operations of actually finding, destroying Hamas, how much the tunnels fit their evolution to guerrilla warfare. But how do you destroy a tunnel? Which is a big question that I'm getting now is that, like, even if we have all these things start to fall into place and you want to create stability, 'cause that's what we're talking about, creating terror-free, de-radicalized pockets of stability. Of course, you'd have to address the underground in those areas. And this is, again, people will make this like, oh, it's too hard. Like, I don't even see how it's possible if they take the largest number, right? And I deal with a lot with people using numbers. But in a very small area, now you have less of a tunnel infrastructure. So what is the best way to destroy the infrastructure? And the IDF have done 2 years work of work, even mapping the terror network and not necessarily destroying it, and then evolving the ways you can destroy it from ways that were known before to innovations that have been created now, like the mixture of water and concrete to create a concrete-like filling that is you can build on top of. And I think that's a huge part of when we start talking about creating pockets of stability demilitarized in the Gaza Strip will be all this work that the IDF has done for 2 years to map every inch of this Gaza metro, as they call it. And there's still discovery that has to be done. So if you think about Egypt, who's pumping in, bulldozers and cranes right now, you start to dig. One, you have an unexploded ordnance issue that will be massive,
Mhm.
require resources, and why all those countries, they haven't stated what resources they're going to give, but you could imagine that demining will be a big part of that. As you start to do this Disneyland theory of creating pockets of stable, demilitarized zones with Palestinian local leadership, all these elements, digging that and making sure either destroying tunnels or filling tunnels will be a big part. So even when Hamas renames itself, which it already has done,
Mhm.
and it is a strategy of the irreconcilable, radicalized people, which there are a lot of, and it takes time, years, decades to start at the education process to de-radicalize. Is that would be if you left them that asset of the tunnels, even for local security, it would be a massive problem for any stabilization force, which again, Gaza is a little different because that will not be Israel, even society-wise. Israel will not govern parts of Gaza. Like, that's been clear since day one. So any new stabilization force, you don't want them facing the nightmare of a terrorist, let alone what group, having this city underneath them to destabilize areas and cause that country at the very strategic level to not want to be a part of the work that needs to be done. So I could see that. That's why it's so important is it's a major military resource for anybody, let alone just Hamas, to use and stop this plan from going forward.
John, it's not only a monumental task, it sounds like this is a task that has never been repeated on Earth. I mean, now that you're saying not only are we destroying the tunnels of our enemy, we have to do so in such a way that they can, in the future, build universities and schools on top of them. And so, therefore, if you leave a
Correct.
massive crater underneath the ground, I mean, let me ask you this, and with this, I want to wrap up. And your time has been very, very precious. This is just what Israel has done, as you and I both know, and many of our listeners and viewers may know, is something that the world has never seen in terms of carrying out our own warfare and in terms of thinking about what is best for the enemy and their future growth. What do you think, and when do you think will happen? The world is going to look back at this and say, wow, Israel were the ones that did this. We're learning from Israel. They were the leaders, and we want to be like them.
So I have a list of about 20 tactical lessons just from my nature of the urban warfare aspect. But I think the signal here, of course, there's an Israeli standard to war that I've also written heavily about that is unique only to Israel. The double standards, the delegitimation, demonization. It is very unique to Israel, but there's still strategic lessons in war that can be learned from Israel, like the fact that it is a contest of will. And so many people, even that I know, that call themselves experts, their strategic advice to Israel, to include other nations, was just stop, ceasefire now. You can't achieve your goal. This will be a testament to that's not how wars are won. That's not how the peace is achieved. If you stop now, kick the can later, that is the cycle of violence. So at that very strategic level, we other nations will now look back as we have wars going on right now in the world, is that we've been told a lie that you hit this point of it's not worth the cost. Freedom is worth a lot of cost, and that's historical. And survival for the nation of Israel, this very small nation in a very tough neighborhood, has done the unthinkable again. And there are some nuances to that and how they defeated a seven front war. But in the war in general, is that it is a contest of wills and it is worth fighting for. And don't listen to this terrible, even academic institutions that have these ideals about war. There are things worth fighting for, and you can win as long as you maintain the resolve to achieve a very legitimate goal. And we're unfortunately living in a world where you have all these experts saying that you can't win. It's a numbers game. For Israel, is your political stature in the international community you're viewed as a pariah state. Like, while those things are factors, survival of your nation, the role of a nation state to protect their population are of greater factors. And yes, when attacked, you can win a war. And it is a contest of wills. Israel will show that Israel's society and Israel's leadership about knowing how to manage even a current geopolitical setting. The worst thing of fighting with allies is fighting without them, as Churchill famously said, and I think Israel has reiterated that lesson. Some allies are more important than others. There's some very strategic lessons, but for me, it's a lesson of you. There are some tried and true common principles about war for survival, and this was a war for survival in Israel. Other nations should take a lot from this experience of Israel because they try to negate, well, it's not that big of a problem. This ideals of appeasement, the idea of containment, there's so many lessons here that I hope the world takes.
Colonel John Spencer, I have to say that the memory of the Jewish people and an ancient Israel is very, very long. We can look back at times we've stood alone. We stood alone against Assyria and Babylon and Rome, as we've seen in the city of David and the Holocaust and so many other things where we've stood alone but not alone, because there's been righteous people that saw the truth, and they've been carried into history with us and into the future in terms of our national memory. And I want to say, John, we're at an important turning point in this war. And I really do take this, not only your insights, but your courage and your faith in Israel and your ability to see the truth and not be swayed by the defeatism of the world is truly precious. And I think I speak on behalf of all of our viewers and listeners. Thank you for helping being a guiding light for us. I really do believe that. And we'll see how this unfolds. And I would love to in the future, one day, we'll get your great feedback on how this has already reached the final phase and how we're having regional peace in the Middle East. And then Israel will have to get used to being a regional power.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doron, and thank you for what you do. And it's been an honor speaking with you.
You too. Thanks, Sean.